Welcome to Asset Repositioning for Medium and Large PHAs, an illustration of major program tools. My name is Greg Byrne. I will be your instructor or narrator today. I am the Director of the Transaction Division for the Office of Recapitalization, which oversees the Rental Assistance Demonstration Program. This presentation is part of a series of videos, webinars, and other program guidance offered by HUD to assist PHAs, public housing authorities, with repositioning their public housing. This training will last about 75 minutes. We'll be covering a lot of topics, so please feel free to pause this video at any time, to replay any topic, and just generally to go at your own pace. Today's training is targeted to PHAs with more than 250 public housing units. A similar video has been prepared specifically for small PHAs who have very different organizational characteristics and have different program requirements and flexibilities. We have also prepared a written text of this presentation, which, along with the small PHA video, you can find at www.radresource.net. The goal of this training is not to cover the very detailed instructions on the various programmatic requirements associated with each conversion option. We will not, for example, review the precise submission requirements for a Section 18 disposition application. Rather, the goal is to sketch out the available HUD options for medium and large PHAs to reposition their public housing, as well as how those tools can be used in combination. The idea is to provide a general overview of the different options. At the end of the presentation, we will share links of where more detailed guidance can be found. This training is divided into three parts: this introduction, then a review of conversion options, and then a case study. Viewers who are familiar with the conversion options can choose to skip or skim the conversion options section and go directly to the case study, and the accompanying narrative document will have video time marks. This training is intended for any PHA staff who might be involved in repositioning planning. However, we also encourage PHA leadership to share this video as appropriate with board members and other local stakeholders. For this training, we will look at the fictitious Middleton Housing Authority, or MHA. MHA has a total of 750 public housing units, but also administers a 1,000-unit voucher program. We'll talk more about MHA shortly. We wanted to create a PHA with a sufficient number of properties to demonstrate the range of tools and situations that medium and large PHAs may face with repositioning, but not something too large as to make the training unwieldy. The issues facing very large PHAs would essentially be the same. The only difference would really just be a matter of scale and sheer number of properties. When we use the term public housing repositioning, we mean removing a project from the public housing program and placing it under the Section 8 Housing Assistance Program. We also refer to it as a conversion, as in converting from public housing to the Section 8 program. Now, repositioning or conversion can often involve or be coupled with a recapitalization of a property. For example, a PHA may choose to convert a project to the Section 8 program and simultaneously take out a new first mortgage to pay for needed repairs. But in other situations, a PHA may decide on a two-step process where the project first converts to Section 8 but undertakes a larger recapitalization event at a later time. Therefore, while one of the main goals of repositioning is to make it easier for a project to raise proceeds to meet physical needs, such a refinancing does not necessarily have to occur at the same time as the project converts, with the caveat that under RAD, a PHA must at least meet the capital needs identified in a third-party physical needs assessment. Before we examine more why a PHA would want to convert to Section 8, let's take a moment to review what programmatically distinguishes public housing from Section 8. So what is public housing? The public housing program was created with the Housing Act of 1937 to meet the housing needs of low-income households. Today there are about 1 million public housing units across the country administered by some 3,000 local PHAs. PHAs enter into an annual contributions contract, or ACC, with HUD, but the ACC has no funding guarantee or any agreed-upon funding levels. Initially, the federal government paid the debt service on the bonds that financed the construction of public housing, and PHAs used tenant rents to cover operating expenses. Over time, as operating costs increased, as buildings aged, and as tenant incomes and therefore rents decreased, the Congress introduced various attempts to help subsidize the operating costs and capital repairs to public housing. Today, there are two main public housing funding programs, the Operating Fund and the Capital Fund program. Amounts under each are awarded based on formulas and are subject to annual congressional appropriations, meaning they can go up or down in any year. In 2019, the Congress appropriated $4.7 billion for the Operating Fund program and $2.8 billion for the Capital Fund program. In addition, PHAs collected about $3.4 billion in tenant rents for total public housing funding of about $10.9 billion in 2019. PHAs also execute a use restriction, usually called a Declaration of Trust, or DOT, which ensures that the project is used for low-income housing. This DOT also restricts a PHA from placing any encumbrance or debt on public housing property without HUD approval. Although the DOT doesn't necessarily prevent the PHA from leveraging a public housing property, such as securing a mortgage, as long as it first obtains HUD approval, it's more the case that the public housing program was never conceived to rely on private debt and equity. Consequently, as will be described shortly, public housing's various program structures really aren't conducive to private financing. So what is Section 8? Let's look at the Section 8 program. In 1974, after more than a decade of experimenting with different means of encouraging private ownership and development of low-income housing, that is, alternatives to the public ownership of public housing, the Congress created the Section 8 program, adding a new Section 8 to the Housing Act in 1937. It was the first true deep subsidy program wherein HUD would make up the difference between an approved contract rent to the owner and the rent that the low-income households would pay. There were actually two Section 8 programs that Congress created. The first was Section 8 vouchers, called certificates back then, where tenants would find housing on the private market. Today, there are about 2.2 million vouchers in circulation nationally. The second was Section 8 project-based rental assistance, or what we refer to as PBRA, where the Section 8 subsidies were attached to specific buildings or developments. Today, there are about 1.2 million PBRA units, although that number has decreased over the years as long-term Section 8 contracts expired and some owners chose to opt out and not renew. Initially, PBRA was the only project-based Section 8 program, but then in 1998, Congress authorized the Project-Based Voucher, or PBV program, allowing PHAs to use up to 20% of their voucher authority for project-based vouchers, or PBVs. Today, there are around 200,000 PBV units nationwide, or about 10% of the voucher inventory. This new PBV program, however, also came with some restrictions not present in the PBRA program. Most notably, one, that not more than 25% of the units in a project could be project-based, but with some exceptions for elderly, scattered sites, or units that were receiving supportive services. And two, that all tenants after 1 year were given the option to move with the first available voucher, what has been known as choice mobility. Now, later in 2016, Congress eased some of these restrictions, including eliminating the income mixing requirement for PBV projects considered previously assisted, which would include public housing conversions. One of the key program differences then between Section 8 and public housing is the availability of long-term housing assistance payments contracts, or HAP contracts, with built-in rent adjustments. These contract provisions have been essential to lenders in the underwriting of a project. Nothing remotely like it exists in public housing. In public housing, there's really no such thing as a contract rent. There is no long-term subsidy contract, and there's no automatic rent adjustment factor, all of which make mortgage lending difficult. why convert? Although conversion to Section 8 is entirely voluntary, the Department believes that the Section 8 program can be a better vehicle for the long-term preservation of property that was developed under the public housing program. The reasons for this are mostly threefold. First, Section 8 is a more reliable and stable funding platform. In some conversions, as will be demonstrated later in the presentation, the rents may actually be higher than in public housing. Second, Section 8 provides PHAs with a better ability to attract or leverage private debt, such as a first mortgage, or as well as equity, as in low-income housing tax credits, to take care of backlog capital needs and also to ensure adequate reserves for future replacements of systems and equipment. And third, the Section 8 program, from a regulatory perspective, is generally considered simpler to run and administer, which should lead to cost savings. Again, conversion is entirely voluntary, and a PHA can decide to convert one or all of its public housing assets. However, we generally advise PHAs to think of converting, if possible, all of their units so they can consolidate operations. It's much easier to administer an agency operating only one housing subsidy program than two or more. Hence, when we get to the case study, we will assume that the PHAs try and find a way or a path to convert all of its units to Section 8, not just one of its properties. Obviously, full conversion will be an easier exercise to accomplish the smaller the PHA's public housing inventory or the fewer the number of properties. In this section, we're going to review the four main options for getting public housing onto the Section 8 platform. They are first, the Rental Assistance Demonstration Program, or RAD, Section 18 Demolition or Disposition, Streamlined Voluntary Conversion, or SVC, and Section 32 Homeownership. We're going to spend a few minutes running through each of these programs, but as a brief summary, as shown in the diagram, a PHA can first convert under RAD to either Section 8 PBRA or PBV. Next, it can convert under Section 18, receive Section 8 Tenant Protection Vouchers, or TPVs, and then either project-base those TPVs or issue the TPVs to the residents so that they may find housing in the private market. PHA cannot, however, under Section 18, convert as they can under RAD to PBRA. Third, PHA can convert under Streamlined Voluntary Conversion, receive TPVs, and then either project-base the TPVs, but with tenant consent, or issue the TPVs to the residents to rent housing in the private market. And like Section 18, there's no PBRA option under Streamlined Voluntary Conversion. However, a medium or large PHA must wait until it gets down to its last 250 public housing units to be eligible for Streamlined Voluntary Conversion. And lastly, a PHA could convert units to low-income homeownership under Section 32, wherein HUD will provide TPVs as replacement housing for that community as units are sold off. Now for more of the specifics of each program, we'll begin with RAD. In 2011, Congress authorized the RAD program, which allows PHAs to convert their public housing to Section 8 assistance. With subsequent congressional authorizations, HUD now has the authority to convert 455,000 public housing units to Section 8 under RAD. To date, some 130,000 units have already converted, proving that converting to Section 8 really is an effective means of attracting private capital to preserve public housing. RAD is known as a no-cost or no new funding program. The Congress did not appropriate any additional funds for RAD. Instead, a PHA combines its operating fund with its capital fund amounts by project and then adds this combined subsidy, which is now called the housing assistance payment, to the tenant rents to create the Section 8 contract rent. Let's look at an example of how this works. The top bar on the chart on the screen shows the current public housing funding for a hypothetical public housing project. Here the tenant rents in purple are $318, The operating subsidies in light blue are $330, and the capital funds in orange are $144, all expressed in per unit monthly amounts, or PUMs. Combined, these add up to $792. Now, under RAD, the project will leave or be removed from the public housing program and will have a Section 8 contract rent of the same amount, $792. The operating fund and the capital fund get replaced with Section 8 housing assistance payments shown in yellow. The project will also enter into a long-term HAP contract, which provides annual rent adjustments, and will execute a RAD use agreement, which ensures that the property is maintained as low-income housing. As with other Section 8 contracts, if tenant rents go down in a year, the HAP subsidy goes up. And if tenant rents rise, the HAP subsidy goes down. What then is the significance of converting public housing rents and subsidies into a Section 8 contract rent? Why does it really matter? The primary advantage is that these Section 8 contract rents and the long-term contracts facilitate lending. The public housing program doesn't have the equivalent of a contract rent. Yes, a PHA collects tenant rents, which represent about 1/3 nationally of the PHA's budget. But then the PHA also receives, under separate program rules and calculations, operating subsidies and capital subsidies. Therefore, there's not a specific contract rent in public housing, which means that a PHA can't easily sit down with a lender and assess a project's rental income. Public housing project's income is more nebulous and not as reliable as the Section 8 contract rent. Moreover, the public housing funding levels fluctuate from year to year, whereas in Section 8, there's a long-term assistance contract with built-in adjustments for inflation. That's huge. It's hard for a lender to get sufficiently comfortable with the public housing funding system, no less understand it, to commit to long-term mortgage capital. On the other hand, lenders understand how to finance and refinance Section 8 housing. Under RAD, a PHA has the option of converting to two forms of long-term project-based Section 8 assistance. There's first PBRA, Project-Based Rental Assistance. This program is administered by HUD's Office of Multifamily Housing. As mentioned earlier, it was the first Section 8 project-based program created by the Congress. It's also by far the largest. And then there's PBVs, or Project-Based Vouchers. This is the newer alternative form of project-based Section 8 authorized by Congress in 1998. It's a component of the voucher program. Here, a local voucher agency is the contract administrator, and the Office of Public and Indian Housing oversees the voucher agency, but is not a direct administrator of the PBV contract. Additionally, if a PHA does not operate a voucher program, it will need to partner with a current voucher agency to administer the PBVs. Although we generally talk about RAD rents equal to current funding in the public housing program, there are some RAD rent caps. If a PHA is converting to PBRA and the rents exceed 120% of the FMR, which is very rare, the PHA must provide a rent comparability study to support those rents up to 150% of the FMR. And if the PHA is converting to PBV, the RAD rents can never exceed the lower of the reasonable rent, or 110% of the FMR, which are just the basic rules under the PBV program. Other key features of RAD include, first, RAD is a preservation program, hence it has a requirement for one-for-one replacement with exceptions for certain de minimis reductions. Two, under RAD, the converted project must be owned or controlled by a public or nonprofit entity, which could take the form of direct PHA ownership, or, often in the case of tax credits, a long-term ground lease with the tax credit partnership. Three, residents also have an absolute right to return, including any households that today might be over income. Four, RAD requires long-term HAP contracts and long-term use agreements, which HUD must offer to renew, and which the PHA must accept, essentially creating low-income housing in perpetuity. Five, RAD also allows a PHA to transfer the assistance, what is called a TOA, to another site or property if such transfer is in the best interest of the PHA and resident. And 6, RAD allows a PHA to bundle rents across properties to facilitate conversion. For example, a PHA could reduce rents at a project with lower needs and increase rents at a project with higher needs, as long as overall these actions were revenue neutral. In terms of transaction processing, under RAD, a PHA first applies. It's a very simple online application, and then gets awarded a CHAP, or a commitment to enter into a housing assistance payment contract. PHA then has 9 months with opportunities for extensions to submit a financing plan. As part of that financing plan, a PHA must obtain a third-party capital needs assessment, or CNA, that looks at both existing needs and needs over the next 20 years, with some streamlined CNA requirements for certain classes of properties, such as projects recently constructed or being financed with low-income housing tax credits. Before a PHA can actually submit that financing plan, it must first request a concept call, where it explains how it plans to address the capital needs over the 20 years, whether through annual reserve deposits or through upfront sources such as mortgage proceeds or public housing funds or tax credit equity. It is then invited to submit the financing plan, which, once approved, results in the issuance of a RAD conversion commitment, or RCC, allowing the PHA to convert or close, and if needed, to begin rehabilitation. Upon closing, the property is removed from the public housing program, thereby releasing it from the current declaration of trust. A RAD use agreement is executed and recorded, and the PHA enters into a long-term HAP contract. At this point, the project has converted. Now, just a note to say that some PHAs may demonstrate that they can meet their 20-year capital needs through, say, just setting aside a large annual deposit to reserves, or what we refer to as a no-debt deal. Indeed, some PHAs will convert but still plan to undertake a larger recapitalization event in a few years. Under RAD, that's fine. The PHA just needs to show us that it can meet all items identified in the capital needs assessment. And if they want to do more work down the road, that's certainly up to them. The next conversion option is the Section 18 program, referring to Section 18 of the Housing Act of 1937, which governs the demolition and disposition of public housing. It was created in 1998. Prior to that time, a PHA had to replace every public housing unit demolished or disposed with a hard unit. This one-for-one replacement proved challenging and therefore resulted in lots of severely distressed properties stuck in a state of limbo with no funds to adequately restore the project, but still the PHA prevented from removing it. Section 18 eliminates the one-for-one requirement, provided that the project meets certain criteria. Before we get to that criteria, let's talk about what happens when you get approved for Section 18. First, unless a PHA simply wants to demolish the structures and retain the title, it must actually dispose of the asset. Now, it can either sell the property at fair market value, in which case the proceeds must be used for public housing or Section 8 purposes, or it can dispose of the units for less than fair market value for commensurate public benefit, which generally means the provision of housing for low-income households. Very often, PHAs will dispose of Section 18 properties to a nonprofit arm of the PHA and then redevelop the property as affordable housing. Second, with its Section 18 approval, the PHA gets Section 8 tenant protection vouchers, or TPVs, for every unit that has been occupied within 24 months of the Section 18 approval. Subject to appropriations, HUD essentially makes the community whole in terms of the number of assisted housing units, replacing those lost public housing units with vouchers. Now, in some cases, the property is in such poor condition that a PHA is happy just to rid itself of the property via demolition or disposition. But other times, particularly when the property is removed for non-obsolescence reasons, which we'll explain shortly, PHAs are able to project-base the TPVs to salvage or preserve the buildings. And the PBV rents may be higher than what the PHA was getting under the public housing program, because the rents will be based on what HUD would pay under the voucher program and not the public housing program. There are 6 basic criteria under Section 18, and these are outlined in PIH Notice 2018-04. The first is obsolescence. To meet the obsolescence test, a property must have existing capital needs, including those projected over the next 3 years, equal to 57.14% of HUD's total development cost, or TDCs, for non-elevator structures and 62.5% for elevator structures. In other words, the PHA must be able to demonstrate that the property is in pretty poor physical condition. The next is health and safety. A PHA can also qualify for Section 18 if it presents clear health and safety risks to tenants that cannot reasonably be abated, such as a property located adjacent to a large electrical transformer station that emits loud noise disturbances. And there's scattered sites. A PHA can remove any scattered site units that are operationally unsustainable. Indeed, for most PHAs, scattered sites have proven hard to maintain effectively, especially at public housing funding levels. For the purpose of Section 18, a scattered site is defined as any non-contiguous property with 4 or fewer units. So, for example, the picture shown on the left clearly meets this definition, whereas the scattered site, but the picture on the right would not. The next criterion is 50 or fewer public housing units. When a PHA only has 50 or fewer units, or when a larger PHA gets down to its last 50 public housing units, it is automatically eligible to remove those last 50 units via Section 8, including combined RAD and Section 18 transactions that involve the last public housing units. For example, if a PHA has 70 remaining public housing units, it could, as long as it was part of one transaction, convert 20 units through RAD and remove the remaining 50 units via Section 18. The fifth criterion is called the RAD Section 18 blend. HUD also allows PHAs to substitute 25% of the units in a RAD transaction for Section 18 with accompanying TPDs, provided the transaction is undertaking substantial rehab and provided the project is not being financed with 9% credits. The rehab hard costs must equal or exceed 60% of HUD's housing construction cost, or HCC number, for the type of units involved, or what also works out to of 36% of TDC. And the last criterion is called efficient and effective. It's when a PHA can demonstrate that the removal of the units can result in the creation of more efficient and effective housing, but there's no test of obsolescence. However, HUD will only provide TPVs for 25% of the units. Now, the actual number of units that the PHA will create, i.e. the more efficient and effective units, is negotiated between the PHA and HUD on a case-by-case basis. For example, assume that a PHA generally has an undesirable 100-unit project that doesn't meet the obsolescence test, but the PHA would still like to tear it down and build 50 units as replacement. Now, because it doesn't meet obsolescence, HUD will only provide 25 vouchers, or 25% of the 100 units. The PHA will, in this case, contribute 25 vouchers from its own voucher program, which it will then project base. Now, not many PHAs, understandably, have pursued this criterion. It's usually saved for an asset that a PHA finds very undesirable, and yet does not meet the obsolescence test, and where the PHA would be willing to remove it, even when HUD will only provide TPVs for 25% of the units. The third major repositioning option is Streamlined Voluntary Conversion, or SVC. In 1998, Congress added Section 22 to the Housing Act of 1937, allowing any PHA to replace public housing with vouchers whenever it could demonstrate that it was cheaper to give each family a voucher, that is, voluntary conversion. However, the associated methodology and cost test has proved extremely challenging for small PHAs to master. Hence, in early 2019, PIH issued a notice, PIH Notice 2019-05, providing for a streamlined approval for voluntary conversion, applicable to PHAs with 250 or fewer units, in which it waived the cost test. As with Section 18, under a streamlined voluntary conversion, a PHA receives a TBV for each unit occupied during the past 24 months since HUD's Section 22 approval. If the subject property following conversion will continue as rental housing, the PHA must offer the TBVs to the residents to rent in place, but a PHA can also project-base the TBVs provided it obtains tenant consent. Otherwise, the PHA must provide the TBVs to the residents. For medium and large PHAs, streamlined voluntary conversion becomes an option once the PHA gets down to 250 or fewer units. The final main repositioning option for PHAs is Section 32 Homeownership, which refers to Section 32 of the Housing Act of 1937. It allows a PHA to sell public housing units to low-income households based on a PHA-adopted homeownership plan. Section 32 is actually a quite flexible program. Other than the basic program requirement that the purchasers must be low income, the PHA largely determines program eligibility and other participation requirements. Any sales proceeds generated must be used for public housing or Section 8 purposes, and any units sold that were occupied in the past 24 months receive a Section 8 TPV. Of course, not all, in fact few, public housing properties make good homeownership projects. A PHA, for example, is not likely to convert a mid-rise family project to homeownership or even a senior high-rise, but scattered sites, on the other hand, might be something worth considering if a PHA has interest in a homeownership program, but it's also the case that a PHA could do homeownership under Section 18. For example, if a PHA were interested in converting scattered sites to homeownership, the PHA could also qualify for Section 18 as scattered sites and then create its own homeownership program outside of Section 32. Although Section 32 is a path to Section 8 TPVs, it's not a path to project-based Section 8 because obviously the units are being sold off. Let's go over the master repositioning chart one more time to summarize where we are in terms of conversion options. Under RAD, a PHA can convert to Section 8 PBRA or PBV. However, it will be capped at current funding, which is converted to a RAD contract rent. But there's no required disposition of the asset and no requirement for tenant consent. Of course, resident consultation is required for RAD and for all repositioning options. Then under Section 18, if a project qualifies, the PHA will be eligible for TBVs for all units occupied in the past 24 months, and which, if feasible, the PHA can elect to project base without tenant consent. But the PHA must also dispose of the property, which it could do by disposing to a nonprofit subsidiary. Sometimes these are called instrumentalities or affiliates of the PHA. And then under streamlined voluntary conversion, once down to its last 250 units, the PHA can remove the units from public housing and will receive a TPV for any unit occupied in the past 24 months. No disposition is required. However, if the PHA wants to project-base the TPVs on the converting units, tenant consent is required. And lastly, under Section 32, a PHA can sell units under a homeownership program for low-income households in which HUD will make available Section 8 TPVs as replacement housing. Now, before we move to our case study, we want to review 5 more program rules or requirements that can greatly affect repositioning planning. We'll start with PBV Rent Rules. Under the PBV program, rents are set according to the lowest of the rent requested by the owner, 110% of the FMR adjusted by any utility allowances for the project, and then the reasonable rent for the unit. These above rules have 2 major implications in repositioning planning. First, in the case of conversions under Section 18 or streamlined voluntary conversion, the PBV rents, meaning the rents that would be commanded based on obtaining TPVs and project basing them, can potentially be higher than the RAD rents. That's because the RAD rents are based on current public housing funding levels, whereas the non-RAD PBV rents are based on really FMRs and rent reasonableness. In an area where, with FMRs that are higher than public housing funding, the PHA may be better off financially by converting to Section 18 or Streamlined Voluntary Conversion than if it converted under RAD if it's eligible. Second, the opposite can occur, that is where the public housing funding is actually higher than market rents. In these cases, the RAD rents will be capped by market, because under the PBV program, an owner never gets more than the market or reasonable rent. When this happens, the PHA may want to consider converting to RAD PBRA, where the PHA is allowed to keep the current funding as long as it does not exceed 120% of the FMR, which again happens rarely. Next, phase-out funding. Under the public housing program, a PHA is eligible for certain phase-out or phase-down funding of the operating fund or the capital fund, depending on the method of removal. First, there's DDTF funding. DDTF stands for Demolition, Disposition, Transition funding. Under DDTF, a PHA is eligible for 5 additional years of capital funding whenever a unit is removed through Section 18, but not through RAD or Streamlined Voluntary Conversion. And then there's ARF funding. ARF stands for Asset Repositioning Fee. Under ARF, a PHA is eligible for 3 years of reduced operating funds whenever a unit is removed through a Section 18 demolition action, and 2 years of reduced operating funds for a disposition action. No ARF funds are available under RAD or Streamlined Voluntary Conversion. And then there's Faircloth Authority. In 1999, Congress added a provision that prohibits a PHA from building public housing units in excess of then current levels, named after the legislation's sponsor, Senator Locke Faircloth of North Carolina. When a PHA removes units from public housing through either Streamlined Voluntary Conversion or Section 18, retains that Faircloth Authority, meaning that it has the authority to return those units to the public housing program if it finds a way to get the units built. Although technically a PHA that repositions through Streamlined Voluntary Conversion can only transfer that Faircloth Authority to another PHA before closeout. A PHA does not keep its Faircloth Authority if it converts to RAD based on the reasoning that these units have already been replaced under RAD. Public housing operating reserves. At conversion, RAD is the only program that allows a PHA to convey its operating reserves to the converted project, using them either as a development budget source or to establish a reserve for the converted project, or both. The RAD legislation included specific language authorizing the use of public housing funds to facilitate conversion. But for Section 18 or Streamlined Voluntary Conversion, a PHA cannot use its public housing reserves for use in a converting project. Under Section 18 or Streamlined Voluntary Conversion actions, those public housing operating reserves must, prior to closeout of the public housing program, either be spent down or transferred to another PHA, otherwise they must be returned to Treasury. And then there's the issue of over-income households. From time to time, PHAs may have families that moved into public housing who obviously were income eligible, but now have seen their incomes increase such that they would not be eligible if they applied anew. In the RAD statute, the Congress specifically grandfathered existing public housing tenants. All existing tenants have a guaranteed right to return, even if at conversion they might otherwise be over-income for the Section 8 program. That special legislative provision just doesn't exist when a PHA converts via Section 18 or Streamlined Voluntary Conversion. A PHA could have some households who are over-income and would not be eligible to receive a Section 8 unit. In these circumstances, a PHA may either want to convert to RAD to ensure that the tenant's right to remain at the project, or the PHA will need to find other ways of accommodating the household with comparable assisted housing, generally for a period of 3 years, such as maybe allowing the family to remain in their current unit at their current rent levels. Now let's see how this plays out via a case study. As indicated earlier, our case study PHA is called the Middleton Housing Authority, or MHA. MHA has 7 properties at this stage in the PHA's planning efforts. It has not yet undertaken a comprehensive physical needs assessment of each property, so the physical description that follows is based on the MHA's own knowledge of its properties, which is typical of where most PHAs will be starting off as they begin repositioning planning. We'll begin with Abbott Heights. It's a 3-story senior property of 80 units with an elevator that was built in 1972, has never been renovated, and as a result needs moderate to major rehab. It also has 10 households who today are paying a public housing flat rent and would be over income for the Section 8 program. Remember, RAD's grandfather provision would allow these units to remain under a HAP contract if converted to RAD. And Heritage Towers is the agency's other senior property. It consists of 2 100-unit towers, 200 units in total, in downtown Middleton. The complex was built in 1962 and has not been rehabbed. It has electric baseboard heat, which is costly and high maintenance. Its plumbing systems need complete replacement, and 80 of the units are efficiency apartments, which have proven very difficult to lease. It does not comply with the current handicap accessibility standards, which the project would be required to meet if it is renovated. Also, it does not meet current codes for sprinklers or fire suppression, which would also be triggered for any major modernization. Northside Duplexes includes a total of 30 units in 15 duplex buildings that were constructed in the late 1980s. These 15 buildings are on separate, non-contiguous sites. They're in fair condition, but are a challenge to operate. Renaissance Homes is a 60-unit property that was built under the Public Housing Mixed Finance Program in 2002 and is in good condition, but needs some updating or refreshing. When MHA built these mixed finance units, it also created a nonprofit subsidiary called Middleton Affordable Housing, or MAH, which is the controlling general partner of the owner entity. Village Square consists of 40 quadruplex units, 10 buildings, on one site arranged around a cul-de-sac. MHA fully renovated these units in 2012 with ARA stimulus funds, and as a result, the project is in very good condition. West Lawn Gardens is a 20-unit low-rise general occupancy property that was built in 1964 and is in very poor physical condition. The property was built on a side of a hill, and there are a host of structural problems that cannot be readily corrected. The property also has an existing energy performance contract, or EPC, from 2015, which has another 10 years and $150,000 in outstanding principal. And finally, Washington Courts is a 220-unit general occupancy property built in 1964 and covering 25 acres in near downtown area Middleton. The property is in fair to good condition, but the site is considered to have redevelopment potential with major interest from the city. For ease of illustration, we're also going to assume that the Section 18 or Streamlined voluntary conversion rents, meaning the rents that each project would command if they project-based the TPVs, would be on the order of $150 per unit per month higher than the RAD rents. This means that all else being equal, MHA would prefer conversion under Section 18 over RAD, even if it can find a way to qualify, for Section 18. So, in total, MHA has 7 properties and 750 public housing units. For ease of instruction, we're going to take some liberties in introducing the following assumptions or additional summary information. First, the agency also owns a parcel of land, approximately 5 acres, that remains from a 50-unit project that they demolished in 2019 called Cary Village. The land is assessed at $30,000 an acre. It's located in a non-minority impacted area where the city is also building a new magnet school. As a result of the demolition of Cary Village, the PHA has 50 unused Faircloth units and has 5 years of future DDTF funding, estimated at $120,000 a year or $600,000 in total. Also, because of the demolition of Cary Village, the PHA is receiving the first of 3 years of ARF funding, which in total is estimated at $325,000. The agency has $3 million in public housing operating reserves, which amounts to $4,000 per unit, which is somewhat typical for an agency its size. And finally, as a reminder, MHA also administers a 1,000-unit voucher program. Collectively, the above, along with the 7 public housing properties, represents the assets, really, of the PHA. As with any PHA preparing to embark on a repositioning exercise, we have to understand what MHA's underlying goals are. What is the PHA attempting to accomplish with repositioning? In this case, and remembering that this will be different from PHA to PHA, the MHA's main goal is to preserve as many hard units as feasible. It is not interested in simply vouchering out. However, for its most distressed property, West Lawn Gardens, if there is no reasonable plan either to preserve the units or create new replacement units, it would be willing to have the site demolished and the residents issue PBVs in order for those families to get better housing and in order to better stabilize the neighborhood. It is also not interested in homeownership, even though the north side duplexes might otherwise be good candidates. Now, in terms of secondary goals, the MHA would like to maintain, via any preservation option, control of the asset and not seek to transfer the asset to another PHA or another profit or some other mission-oriented ownership entity. We'd also like to avoid any staff reductions. Although the primary goal is the preservation of long-term affordable housing, we would prefer not to undertake any action that might affect current staffing. And it would like to find a vehicle to preserve each unit that would not require the additional complication or complexity of having to obtain tenant consent to project-based assistance. Thus, while MHA would be eligible for streamlined voluntary conversion once it gets down through various means to its last 250 units, it would prefer to find other conversion options, either RAD or Section 18, than streamlined voluntary conversion. And lastly, it would prefer to convert everything to Section 8. In other words, to get everything on one subsidy platform, if feasible. With the stage now set, let's look at the options. The first place to begin is to scan MHA's portfolio to see if there are any obvious solutions or answers to their portfolio goals. Are there? Well, the most obvious candidate is north side duplexes, which appears to qualify under Section 18 as scattered sites. The units are challenging to operate, particularly at the public housing funding levels, and they consist of 4 or fewer units on non-contiguous sites. Now, although the MHA could just sell the units at fair market value, we'd like to retain the units in its portfolio as long-term assisted housing. In time, it would like to take out a mortgage on these units to undertake some needed recapitalization, but it feels that for now, the higher Section 8 funding will help stabilize the units and hold them over until they're ready to more formally refinance. For these scattered site units to comply with Section 18, MHA will need to dispose of the units. Well, the PHA created a nonprofit subsidiary back when it built its mixed finance project called Middleton Affordable Housing, or MAH, so likely it will dispose of the scattered sites for $1 to MAH, which is permitted under the commensurate public benefit provision, since the units will be used as affordable housing. Also, in order for the units to be placed under a Section 8 HAP contract, the units must substantially meet the voucher program's Housing Quality Standards, or HQS. In this case, the units are not in deteriorated condition. The PHA has identified some immediate repairs that it will undertake, but nothing significant and nothing that would prevent it from passing HQS. And moreover, this strategy doesn't require any relocation of tenants, and all tenants also meet the Section 8 eligibility requirements. Because this property is being removed through Section 18, it will also receive both DDTF and ARF funds, and it will also be able to retain its Faircloth units. We have one down with 6 more to go. Next, we'll turn to Renaissance Homes. This recently completed mixed finance property is a great candidate for RAD because the property is in good physical condition. It should easily be able to convert at the RAD rents. In fact, the property might even be able to donate under rent bundling some of its rents to a property with higher needs. Because it will convert via RAD, it will not be eligible for DDTF, ARF, or Faircloth. For now, we'll set it aside then as a RAD conversion. The next property we'll examine is Abbott Heights. This property needs substantial rehab, but at least from the PHA's understanding of repair needs, would not meet Section 18's obsolescence test, which would be 62.5% of TDC for an elevator building. Abbott Heights also has the 10 households who would be over income for Section 8, and thus the PHA could not put these units under a HAP contract under any repositioning option other than RAD. Let's try to run through the traditional Section 18 options. Abbott Heights is not obsolete. There are no urgent health and safety issues. It's not scattered sites. MHA is interested in preserving as many units as possible, so the Section 18 efficient and effective criterion is really not of any interest to it because HUD would only provide 25% replacement vouchers, and it's also not the last 50 units in the agency's inventory. Consequently, the most likely conversion option for this property would either be 100% RAD or a RAD Section 18 blend with 75% of the units as RAD and 25% as Section 18 with higher rents on the Section 18 units. To qualify, the PHA would need to undertake repairs of at least 36% of TDC or 60% of HCC without relying on 9% credits. Clearly, MHA will still need to prepare additional feasibility studies, but based on the experience of other RAD transactions from around the country, this property appears to fit the profile of a project that could be financed with 4% low-income housing tax credits. And by converting the units to RAD, the PHA can solve the issue of the over-income households. If it pursued this path, it would likely consider developing the project utilizing its nonprofit, MAH, as the developer owner. We'll put down, for now at least, that Abbott Heights will convert under either standard RAD or the with 60 units converting under RAD and 20 under Section 18. At 80 units, it should be large enough to be attractive to lenders and investors as a standalone 4% tax credit project, but the PHA might also want to think about possibly combining it with one or another property to make it even more enticing to lenders and investors, that is, to create a better economy of scale. By converting via the RAD Section 18 blend, it would only be eligible for ARF, DDTF, or Faircloth for the 20 units that would be removed through Section 18. Next, let's turn to the 40 units at Village Square, which was fully renovated just a few years ago. It's not eligible for any of the Section 18 options. It's not scattered sites. It's not obsolete. It's not requiring rehab, sufficient rehab to qualify for a RAD Section 18 blend. So the obvious answer is to convert to RAD, but at the same time, MHA will want to conduct more analysis to see whether it has any extra rents that it could donate to another property, or whether it could generate excess mortgage proceeds that could support other RAD or non-RAD transactions. By converting to RAD, it is not eligible for ARF, DDTF, or Faircloth. At this stage, we really had no heavy lifting. The choices have been pretty logical or feasible. We have 4 properties totaling 210 units that have a a strategy, although we've not firmed up the financing sources yet. But we think we're on the right path in those cases. That leaves us with 3 properties remaining: West Lawn Gardens, Washington Courts, and Heritage Towers, representing a total of 540 units. West Lawn Gardens includes 20 very deteriorated units on a bad site. Although MHA doesn't yet have an independent physical needs assessment for West Lawn Gardens or for any property, MHA feels reasonably certain that the project will qualify under obsolescence, with capital needs exceeding 57.14% of TDC. In that case, it would be eligible for Section 8 TBVs for all units occupied in the past 24 months. Now, despite the fact that the project is distressed, MHA has been able to keep it fully occupied, which means that it would receive TBVs for each unit. Unlike Abbott Heights, West Lawn Gardens is really not a candidate for rehab, even at the higher TBV rents. And the topography of the site doesn't lend itself to rebuilding. Ideally, the site should be raised. In fact, an abutting owner has indicated interest in the property as an apple orchard, but the property really has only modest value. The question is whether the PHA can build replacement units elsewhere, and how would it do that? The PHA could go rad and try to transfer the assistance either to a new construction site, say the vacant land at the former Cary Village, or to some existing non-subsidized property, or maybe even an owner of a tax credit project that would like to have 20 deep subsidy units. But the rents would be less than if the PHA went Section 18 and got TPVs. Most likely then, the preferred option would be to go Section 18 with the higher rents. If the PHA wanted to hold those TPVs for the new construction units, it would either need to stage the removal so that the families are relocated once, only when the new units are built, or the PHA would need to find other vacant units throughout its stock, maybe to move the current residents, and then bank the TPVs for the future redevelopment, assuming the residents preferred to move into the new site. Now, if MHA decided to replace these 20 hard units as opposed to simply vouchering out, it would likely need to seek a significant additional capital beyond what either the RAD rents or the TPV rents would support in first mortgage proceeds in order to make the deal work, such as CDBG funds or home funds or a grant from the Federal Home Loan Bank's Affordable Housing Program or some combination thereof. Or it will need to secure 9% low-income housing tax credits, which are extremely competitive. Anyway, at this stage of the planning process, it's probably best to consider disposing of the property for fair market value under Section 18 obsolescence, but with more due diligence needed before the agency decides whether it has a reasonable chance of replacing these hard units or whether it should simply voucher out the property with the Section 18 TPVs. However, remember that West Lawn Gardens also has an EPC with $150,000 in principal that it will most likely need to pay off at conversion, probably with selling the proceeds from selling the land or having to tap into the existing public housing operating reserves. If the PHA removes the units through Section 18, it will receive ARF, DDTF, and will retain Faircloth Authority. Heritage Towers. This property appears also to be a classic for Section 18 obsolescence, given the condition of the systems and the need for code and handicap accessibility upgrades. So the PHA would be eligible for TPVs, which it would likely want to project base back on the property and couple with maybe 4% tax credits to preserve the property. But there are some problems or considerations. First, the PHA needs to get rid of those efficiency units, which not only will increase project costs, these so-called breakthroughs can be expensive, but will reduce the total number of units and also the gross rental income. Now, under RAD, if you do consolidate vacancies, you can either ask for the funding to be respread over the remaining units, or you can put those lost units into a converted awaiting transfer agreement or CAT agreement and try to transfer those units elsewhere. Second, even if the PHA were to obtain Section 18 approval, can the building be rehabbed with the PBV rents? Will the numbers actually work? And third, what would happen if the PHA can't rehab the building? Would the agency want to try to preserve hard units either on-site or elsewhere? And if so, using what funding program? Or would it need simply to voucher out this project? These are some tough questions, but for our first pass at things, we're going to assume that the PHA will pursue Section 18 obsolescence and look to preserve the property by project-basing the TPVs and seeking 4% credits, but reducing the number of units by 40 for a new total of 160 units. Under Section 18 removal, it would be eligible for ARF, DDTF, and it would retain its Faircloth Authority. We are now down to our last property, Washington Courts, which has a total of 220 units and is in stable condition. Normally, this would indicate that it would be a strong candidate for a fairly straightforward RAD conversion, either with debt or no debt. But other things are in play. First, as the last property and having less than 250 units, Washington Courts would be eligible for Streamlined voluntary conversion, although the agency has indicated that Streamlined voluntary conversion is not a preferred option. Second, also as the last property, it would be eligible for the RAD Section 18 closeout blend, with 170 units converting under RAD and 50 converting under Section 18. And third, as previously described, the property has some potential for redevelopment. It's a large site near the downtown that likely could be rebuilt at much higher densities. But at the same time, where would the PHA get the money to replace the units if it redeveloped the site? Although there was strong interest from the city in redevelopment, Middleton is not, say, Boston, where land values are so high that any market units could greatly subsidize the affordable units. Hence, any redevelopment would still require significant public investment. For now, until more conversations can be had with the city, the best placeholder would be to reposition it through RAD Section 18 closeout blend, where 170 units convert via RAD and 50 convert via Section 18 with the higher TPV funding on those 50 units. By removing the units through RAD Section 18 closeout blend, it would receive ARF, DDTF, and retain its Faircloth Authority for just the 50 units. So there we have it. We've got the makings of an initial portfolio strategy with plans for each property that would eventually close out MHA's public housing program and convert to Section 8. So in Northside duplexes, the preferred option would be Section 18 scattered sites and project basing the TPVs back on site. For Abbott Heights would be a RAD or RAD Section 18 blend. For the Nix Finance Renaissance Home, a straight RAD conversion. For West Lawn Gardens, with those 20 obsolete units to go through Section 18 obsolescence, and PHA may have to just simply issue the family's tenant protection vouchers, but it should look to see whether it can find resources to replace the hard units. For Village Square would be a standard RAD conversion with possibilities for rent bundling and donating to other properties. Heritage Towers seems to be a classic Section 18 obsolescence, where the first choice of the PHA would be try to see if they could project-base the TPVs and then secure 4% tax credits. And lastly, Washington Courts, which is in good condition generally, and although the site has redevelopment potential, it would cost a lot to try to redevelop those properties, and maybe the best option there is to go the RAD Section 18 closeout blend and get a little bit higher rents on those remaining 50 units at the property. But we still have a few other items to clean up. There's the future DDTF funds for Cary Village. Remember, the PHA has some $600,000 in future DDTF funds that are due it as a result of the 2019 demolition at Cary Village, and obviously doesn't want to lose those funds. The best choice would be to use them to maybe increase the rents at Abbott Heights. Under RAD, a PHA can trade in future DDTF funds for a contract rent boost, which in this case would amount to around a $42 per UM increase in the rents for the 60 units at Abbott Heights that would be converting to RAD, assuming the remaining 20 units convert to Section 18 under the RAD Section 18 blend. Now, to calculate that contract rent boost, we took the $600,000 in future estimated DDTF funds, and then we divided by 20 years, which is the term of the HAP contract, and then divided again by 60 units and 12 months a year. And the $3 million in operating reserves. Once a PHA closes out its public housing program, it can't take its reserves with it, but MHA is still a long way from closing out its inventory. So by the time it works through the first half of its portfolio, maybe more of these funds will have been spent, say, on other RAD deals. But eventually, if the PHA gets down to its last project, it will want to plan on how to use those reserves before it actually closes everything out. And what about the vacant land from the demolition of Cary Village? The land is valued at $150,000 in total, and it's still under a declaration of trust. There are several options here. First, depending on the budgets for the other properties, MHA might really just need to sell this land to fill a gap in funding, which, provide the units were either RAD or PBV, would be an eligible use of disposition proceeds. Second, it could also dispose for less than fair market value if the property were to be used to support affordable housing. There may be other affordable housing developers in town that might make a go of that site. Or third, the site could be the future home of the replacement units from West Lawn Gardens if the PHA were able to secure other outside funding to make that deal work, possibly in some mixed income setting. And the 50 units of Faircloth Authority, because the PHA will be closing out its public housing program under Section 18, 50 and fewer option when it gets down finally removing Washington courts, it can no longer use this Faircloth Authority. And so if it hasn't used it, though, it could transfer this authority to another PHA upon closeout, and it could even barter with that PHA for some asset in exchange. And the ARF funding, the asset repositioning fee, the PHA is estimated to receive $325,000 ARF funding over the next 3 years as a result of Cary Village demolition. These funds are going to help the PHA scale down, but probably are not likely to be a significant enough source that can be relied upon for development deals, unlike, say, DDTF. But it's still important to think about the use of those funds. Remember also the PHA will be eligible for new ARF or DDTF funds as well as retention of Faircloth Authority for any units that it removes through Section 18, including any RAD Section 18 blend, but just for the units removed through Section 18. Lastly, the MHA also operates a 1,000-unit voucher program. Consequently, it will also serve as the voucher administrator for any units that it converts to PBVs. Moreover, wherever the PHA project bases the assistance back on site, these projects, because they would be considered previously assisted, would be exempt from the voucher program cap on the number of voucher units that can be project-based. PHA will, however, need to find an independent entity to perform the HQS inspections and the annual determination of rent reasonableness. Now, had the PHA not operated a voucher program, it would have needed to find an existing voucher agency to serve as its contract administrator. Now that we've put all our cards on the table, let's see how well we did vis-a-vis MHA's 5 repositioning goals. For the most part, we've been able to preserve all units, with the exception of the 20 units at West Lawn Gardens and the 40 lost units at Heritage Towers as a result of combining 80 efficiencies into 40 units. Now, the MHA might be able to find a replacement for those units, but it also said that it would be willing to let the units at West Lawn Gardens go, given their poor condition. PHA is also maintaining control of all assets, either directly through the PHA's ownership or through its nonprofit MAH. And other than losing 20 units at West Lawn, there's really nothing that in this plan that should have any implications on staffing. It's also found a way to full conversion without having to go through tenant consent for project basing the assistance. This case study was intended simply to illustrate the kinds of repositioning options available to medium and large PHAs. The PHA in question could have chosen different strategies from the ones we selected here. Indeed, asset repositioning planning is very much an iterative process, requiring multiple passes and refinements as more data is collected and as goals and objectives are clarified. Some medium PHAs might find an easy path to converting all their properties, either through RAD, Section 18, or Streamlined voluntary conversion, whereas some large PHAs with even more properties may find that while they can identify some immediate candidates, full conversion might either be a longer-term effort or one still with some gaps. Those PHAs who have multiple properties will also need to decide about sequencing, as whether to convert all at once or in phases. Clearly, though, the more advanced the PHA gets in its repositioning planning, the more important it will become to obtain a comprehensive physical needs assessment of each property. It's also essential to better understand the rents that each project would command under each conversion option. PHAs should definitely seek appropriate professional guidance where needed. For simplicity, we also assume that for this case study, the Section 8 TPV rents would be higher, $150 PUM higher than the RAD rents. Indeed, in most markets around the country, that's the situation, but there are maybe 10 to 20% of PHAs where the RAD rents are actually higher than market. Remember, under the PBV program, you never get more than the market or reasonable rent. In those circumstances, the PHA will want to convert to RAD PBRA, where the PHA can maintain current funding. What we have not done today is spend time thinking through some of the organizational issues surrounding conversion, including staff training or changes in IT systems as the PHA migrates to Section 8. We hope to address those topics in future training or videos. We hope that this training has better informed you of the possibilities for repositioning and the associated tools available. For more information, please also refer to the Office of Public and Indian Housing's Repositioning website or the Office of Recapitalization's RAD Resource Desk. And finally, here are some tools that may help you assess your portfolio, which can also be found on the RAD Resource Desk. There's the 2018 RAD Rents file. This table includes HUD's calculation of RAD contract rents for each public housing property from around the country, including the local fair market rents. There's the RAD conversion guide for public housing agency. It provides additional instructions on the many conversion requirements under RAD. And there's also the RAD inventory assessment tool, which is a spreadsheet that allows you to determine the maximum first mortgage potential for every public housing project in the country using various mortgage rates or loan periods and other user-defined assumptions. Thank you again for your participation in this training. If you have questions, please feel free to email us at rad@hud.gov.